and welcome back to the show. We're talking with Chris Clearfield, the co-author of Meltdown, Why Our Systems Fail and What We Can Do About It. Chris, you were giving us some great information in both two first and second segments here. I'm wondering about, the fast pace of technology these days. Is that hindering or helping our systems? I know you've mentioned it already makes it complex, but because things change so fast, is it even more of a hindrance to our systems that opens us up to what can we say, risks that we may not actually know are there because our systems are so complex?
I think that, what we see that it's not just the pace of technological change. It's this kind of, this sort of acceleration of specifically complexity being kind of increased and introduced. So, we talked about cars that are now connected, but, so are washers and dryers and so are appliances and things like this. And I think, that's a great example where we've taken these machines that are, well tested and tried and true and sort of do one thing and do it well. And we've networked them. And now that means they're part of this global ecosystem. And, I just think it's sort of fascinating because, one of the things we sort of think about and kind of play with in the book is this idea of, well, traditionally when people think about things like critical infrastructure, what they're thinking about is big things like dams and bridges and tunnels and, the sort of big, kind of banner projects that a region might have. But what I like to think about is, even if you had a relatively a medium-sized city, 200,000, 500,000 people, you could easily imagine there being, 5,000, connected smart washer and dryers in that city. And if those, for some reason, are designed in such a way that, a hacker can take control of them and can sort of spin them up in a way that, causes the motor to catch on fire and maybe some percentage of them, spreads to a house fire or something. That's, we've all of a sudden created this link that actually makes a much bigger piece of critical infrastructure that we've never thought about in that way. And so, that's a place where technology, I think, plays a role. I don't think of myself as a Luddite, although I am a skeptic in some of these contexts. But we also see places where, technology in technology companies, for example, places like Google, you'll notice that their site is never, ever, ever, ever down, right? They have just this unreal uptime, might be down for a second, but then they've got this failover. And what they've done is they've built this into their process naturally. So that's kind of, I think, another lesson as we think about systems. If we're trying to make redundant systems, we've got to build that redundancy. We've got to build that safety in from the beginning, because otherwise we'll be left with we'll be left with these sort of bolt-on additions that actually themselves add complexity and become a source of risk, as we see in this Boeing 737 MAX example that we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned redundancy. I'm sure you've experienced this, that disaster recovery or redundant systems is looked at the end of an initiative. When people are gone, and you just mentioned, you have to start that at the beginning.
Right. It's got to be built in from the beginning. We worked with a firm in New York City that spent, millions of dollars on a backup generator this was a finance firm. So for some of their finance infrastructure in Lower Manhattan. And, that generator would have worked just fine if there had been, if the problem was power outages, right? If there was a rolling brownouts in the city, that gen set would have been great. But it didn't work fine when, Hurricane Sandy came and the entire office building was closed because it was inundated with water, and it took a month or 6 weeks for it to get for the ground floors to sort of the water to recede, to get pumped out, and so it's just an interesting example of where we think about the term that we think about it in, the terms that we think about it in, are this idea of illusory redundancy, where you have this bit of redundancy, but it's vulnerable to the same kind of failure that it's designed to protect. And then almost even worse than that, some of the times it itself becomes the source of that failure or source of complexity.
True, yes. Well, that actually leads me to a different kind of question I was going to ask. When that happens, redundancy at the end, or they don't think about redundancy properly, is it because we're maybe looking for a quick fix? We want to get something out there, want to get something to market, we want to strengthen our system, and then we'll worry about, if something goes wrong.
Yeah, I think one way, I think that's a part of it. And I think one way to think about this question is, like, how do we define, like, what is the minimum part of our system that actually needs to be redundant? And how do we define that? Mm-hmm. And how do we think about that? Adding a bunch of, scalability or safety systems where they're not needed actually adds complexity and creates this vulnerability across our whole system. And I think one of the things that we need to think about as we design these systems, and one of the things we do is, we work with people who are designing these kind of systems, is, setting the bar so you have this set of things that you just accept are going to fail, and there's some risk of it, and you set up your system so that's a totally fine outcome.
Mm-hmm. So let's move to, I wanted to talk about oversight, because the more complex our systems become, and what we can do about them, when, just like your book says, there's got to be more oversight, correct? And what would you recommend on doing that? I think you've touched on a couple, but.
Well, tell me what you mean by the word oversight. Can you talk a little about that?
Oversight and governance. We rush to put all these complex systems together, but we don't really pay attention too much to potential risks. I'll put it in project management terms.
Sure.
Do we need to be more aware and governance to make sure we do have our T's crossed and all our I's dotted before we move on to the next piece?
That's a great question. I think I would put it in different terms, and what I would say is mm-hmm. that the governance model, if you will, that we need to manage complex systems effectively is actually, it's not about dotting I's and crossing T's in some sense. I mean, of course that's important mm-hmm. in different contexts and in different organizations, but the problems of complexity really aren't problems that we can write a procedure for. They are the unexpected problems that arise. So, I would say that if I think about it from a governance perspective, what I think about is how do we get our decision making as to the lowest possible level of the organization that we can, and how do we get the decision making to individuals who know as much as possible about the systems, and how do we kind of acknowledge the real trade-offs that people work with every day between how efficient they want their system to be, how thorough they want to solve the problem, and so I guess what I would say is I think the real benefit of, or the real way that I tend to think about governance is not that it's sort of this top-down thing, but what we need to do a better job of is kind of defining the kind of decisions that people can make, and letting people make all of the decisions that are sort of easily reversible and kind of relatively simple and aren't going to cause a big problem, delegating them as much as possible so we don't have as many I's to dot or T's to cross in the first place.
Is that kind of going back to that corporate culture shift? Or part of that?
Absolutely, right? Yeah, absolutely. So it's no coincidence that the kind of things that help companies be better at managing these kind of risks are the things that also help companies be better at innovating, right? Help mm-hmm. groups of people feel comfortable, taking risks and create organizations that celebrate failure. I talked with people, for example, who work at Amazon and have worked on I don't know if you remember, but Amazon had this Fire Phone project, this sort of competitor, smartphone competitor. And, and the project was really, I mean, from a business perspective, it was a big failure. But where Amazon succeeded incredibly in that context was by taking the teams that were involved and celebrating their work and celebrating that failure. And that's not something you see very often. And what that does, that has such a power. We talked about culture before. That has such a powerful knock-on effect. Now all of those people are willing to try and work on another project where, they can take a risk because they know that that's good for their career, not bad for their career.
So we only have a few minutes left. I know you're on a bit of a time schedule here. How, overall, what would you suggest to all the listeners out there to try and help, no matter how complex their systems are, to keep them running, to keep them, manageable, so that they don't get out of control when or if they do fail? What are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, my final thoughts are that ultimately, at the end of the day, this is really a human question and a personal question. And I think we have the ability to, in the way we run our teams, in the way we make decisions, in the way we organize our businesses, to get better at this, right? It requires a kind of a humility and an openness to learning and an openness to failure. And that's not rocket science, right? But that doesn't make it. Right. That doesn't mean it's easy. These solutions that we talk about in the book, being open to talk about the unexpected things that arise and what you can learn from that. Creating some sort of more structured ways of communicating about failures, paying attention to these small errors. Those are solutions that are simple, but that doesn't make them easy. And so I think that. The thing that I kind of go away with is a lot of us are in a position where we are both managed by someone and we are managers, right? And most of us in that position, we sort of think of ourselves as very open to feedback from the people we manage. But most of us are even if we have a great relationship with our bosses, we're probably pretty guarded in how we give them feedback. And so I think this is kind of the central paradox, right? Where we humans are very social creatures. And so we've got to be, especially the more senior we get, we've got to be really sensitive to these kind of team and interpersonal dynamics. And if we can be a little bit more conscious in how we solicit feedback, an open door policy isn't enough. We've got to be actively out there looking for bad news in our organizations so we can understand what problems are going to arise and solve them before they become really big issues.
Well, that's interesting because it kind of takes us back to the very beginning where I mentioned a lot of people, think of systems as, IT, and yet your recommendation isn't actually IT focused, it's people focused.
Exactly. Yep. I think that's a great summary.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I know that was a key thing in your book here. So I'm glad we kind of went around that whole circle and made it right back to the beginning. So, Chris, I want to thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your expertise. And congratulations on the book. Because I know it's relatively new, isn't it? So it's not that old.
Yeah, so the hardback came out a year ago in March, almost exactly a year ago, actually. And the paperback is being released next week, and it actually has a slightly different subtitle. So it's now Meltdown, What Plane Crashes, Oil Spills, and Dumb Business Decisions Can Teach Us About How to Succeed at Work and at Home. It's kind of a sort of a fun pivot for us.
Well, congratulations on that then, for next week.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much. And I look forward to maybe another book from the two of you on maybe a part 2 on some the people side of things.
Yes, totally. We definitely have ideas in the works, so I'll keep you posted.
Oh, great. Well, thanks very much for joining us, Chris. To everybody out there, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.